everyone who has joined us. Greetings to everyone who has joined us today. My name is Lien Snej, and I'm the director of the Arts and Culture Center at the Middle East Institute. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to our first panel of the DC Arab Literature Festival, narrating the Middle East, taking place today, Tuesday, May 17, and tomorrow, Wednesday, May 18. The festival is presented by the Middle East Institute and the Abu Dhabi Music and Arts Foundation in partnership with the Cheuse Center for International Writers at George Mason University. We are very grateful for their collaboration and support. This would not have been possible without them. For the full program and to register to other panels taking place this afternoon and tomorrow, we are dropping the registration link in the chat for you. And you can also go on our site to see the full program and register there at www.mei.edu, Arts and Culture tab. Getting into our program today, literature is a true mirror of our societies, and a lot of us turn to books to try to locate and understand our own feelings, make sense of the world and the situations around us. We are starting off today with a great panel with some wonderful, esteemed guest novelists. And leading us into this conversation today is Matthew Davis, founder and director of the Cheuse Center for International Writers at George Mason University. He's the author of When Things Get Dark, a Mongolian Winter's Tale, and his work has appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The Washington Post magazine, Guernica, amongst other places. You can find his full bio on our website. But before we begin, and before I hand it over to Matthew, just a few housekeeping notes. Our moderator looks forward to taking audience questions through our Zoom Q&A feature, which you all see at the bottom of your screens. For those calling in by phone or watching our panel on the live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu. If you have any technical issues, please email events@mei.edu. Please feel free to ask a question at any time throughout the panel, and our moderator will incorporate as many as possible in our limited time. For those interested, we'll also be dropping the link to purchase the books that the novelists will be talking about. And now, without further ado, I'd like to turn this into the capable hands of our moderator. Over to you, Matt.
Thank you, Lynn. Thanks so much for that introduction. And thank you to the Middle East Institute and to the Abu Dhabi Music and Arts Foundation for helping to producing this wonderful event, this great literary festival that we'll be having over the course of these next 2 days. And of course, thanks to all of you in the audience. We have a lot of people viewing, which is fantastic. And I'm so honored to be moderating this conversation between three great writers, novelists, nonfiction writers, essayists. And we'll be focusing primarily on novels, but they're just wonderful writers that I'm really happy to introduce and to be in conversation with today. And in fact, that is what this panel is going to be. It's going to be a conversation. I plan on asking each panelist a direct question about their work. And then after that, we will really broaden it out to larger topics that they will all just sort of engage with. So now let's meet Zaina, Ahmed, and Rasha. And I'll start with Zaina. Zaina Arafat is an LGBTQ Arab American fiction and nonfiction writer. She's the author of the novel You Exist Too Much, which won a 2021 Lambda Literary Award and was named Roxane Gay's favorite book of 2020. Her stories and essays have appeared in publications including the New York Times, Granta, The Believer, Virginia Quarterly Review, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, Harper's Bazaar, BuzzFeed, Vice, Guernica, LitHub, and NPR. So welcome, Zaina.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you for joining. And second, Ahmed Naji is a writer, journalist, art critic, and he is an official criminal as well. He's the author of 3 novels, Rogers, Using Life, and Tigers to My Room, and another nonfiction book called Rotten Evidence, Reading and Writing in Prison, the English translation of which will be published by McSweeney's in 2023. In 2016, Ahmed was sentenced to 2 years in prison after a reader complained that an excerpt from Using Life published in a literary journal harmed public morality. He is now a fellow at the Black Mountain Institute in Las Vegas, living there with his family. Welcome, Ahmed. Great. Thank you. And finally, Rasha Abbas. Rasha is a Syrian writer of short stories. She is currently based in Berlin, Germany since 2015. In 2008, she published her first collection of stories, Adam Hates the Television. Her second short story collection, The Invention of German Grammar, was published to much acclaim in 2018. And her third collection, The Gist of It, was published in 2019. She is currently the editor of the cultural section of Al Jumeirah website and the coordinator of the cultural supplement Hamesh, issued by the same website. Rasha, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Matt, and hi, everyone.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. And I think, what we'll do is we'll start. I'm going to ask each of you an individual question about your work, and we'll just sort of moving on from there. And Zaina, I'm going to start with you. And the title of your novel, You Exist Too Much, is from a line in the book spoken by the narrator's mother. The narrator and her girlfriend are at a restaurant in France during a tense time in their relationship. And when the narrator's food is delivered, she starts to cry, one tear dropping onto the tilapia. The tears cause her girlfriend to scold the narrator for her emotion, and for the narrator to recall a line her mother once said to her, "You exist too much." Your novel exudes passion, desire, existence, very personal emotions that are impossible to separate from both the familial and the political in this novel. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that intersection between the personal and the political in your work, especially this novel, and especially in its central relationship between the narrator and her mother.
Absolutely. So, great. Thank you for such a fantastic opening question. I close my eyes sometimes when I think and talk, so don't be alarmed. The sort of one of the book to me sort of existed on these three levels. The level of, it exists in three levels of unattainability, basically. And that the first being the unattainability of love, and the second being the unattainability of culture for somebody who grew up in between worlds. And then the third is the unattainability of a political validation as a Palestinian. And so a lot of that is where that title, You Exist Too Much, also speaks to that. That feeling that the way that one is made to feel as a Palestinian, of feeling as though you exist too much, based on the powers that be, right? And so in terms of the personal and the political, one of the central narratives of the book is based around the mother-daughter relationship, and the fact of the mother being an immigrant, and the daughter being first generation, and the sort of divide that exists by virtue of them inhabiting these two spheres, and sort of trying to carve out a relationship in spite of this divide. There's also the dynamics of the narrator being queer, and the mother and the narrator both coming from a culture and a background in which this is, well, I don't want to say unacceptable, but just less familiar, we'll say, at the time that the book is taking place. And so, these sort of family dynamics, these personal dynamics are the foreground of the book. And in the background, there is this political sort of reality. And of course, along with the political, the sort of cultural as well. And the ideas around what it means to be detached from a place, to be exiled from a place, to be sort of wanting to belong to a place that is unattainable to you. And I tried to one thing that was really important to me in the book was to not foreground the political. I mean, I started out as a nonfiction writer, and I turned to fiction because I found it to be a more subversive, effective way to reach people when it comes to politics, but to sort of do so through characters and human stories. So once a reader told me that, this is the most book about Palestine and the least book about Palestine, because it's very much in the background, but also so much of being Palestinian is what shapes the character's behavior, and what shapes the mother's behavior as well, of growing up under occupation, of growing up between wars, of having to immigrate at a young age and be married. So yes, the political reality shapes the personal dynamics, but it's very much meant to be sort of underlying the story rather than foregrounding it.
That's great. I love that idea of fiction as a more subversive way to get at political issues. That's lovely. Thank you for that. And Ahmed, your novel Using Life, which parts of which were reprinted, and that was the book that got you arrested and imprisoned. It's the novel is in some ways it's kind of like a conflicted homage to Cairo in many ways, and the place you called home before you needed to leave for your safety, and in Using Life, but also in your other works, especially of nonfiction, and memoir and essay. Place is really vital in your work, whether it's a prison cell in Cairo or the country where you now find yourself living in exile. And so I was curious, has place always been an important thing for you to write about, or has it become even more so since you've had to leave Egypt? We can't hear you. Hey, Ahmed, we can't hear you. Yeah, you're muted.
Yeah, I never noticed it before, but I think you are right. I always saw my writing is going around two basic themes, love and friendship. But I guess place is important because places form how love and relationship is happening and interact. It's getting more, of course, place is getting more important and essential in my writing after leaving Cairo, because in Egypt and in Cairo you were growing as a writer and doing your work as a writer in your environment where you build your language and your knowledge, and you know the audience and you know the place codes. But then when you immigrant, when you have to leave all of this, it's just like all your experience, all your history is being cut and deleted. And you came here with several ideas. One of the ideas is that, let's forget the past and start from the zero and a fresh start, which is refreshing and give you this optimistic that usually immigrants will have in their first 3 or 5 years. And then you come here and discover, it's not a new start. You actually are coming to continue a role that been played by other immigrants and by other writers before you. And you found there is a specific slot for you to fill in. And also there is a question, because I ended up in Las Vegas, which is also an immigrant city, but not an immigrant city like West Coast, where like most of like immigrants literature is happening. Like usually immigrants are writing in East Coast or in big cities in LA. In Las Vegas, it's a very small city, very unique, has its history, and step by step you start to question, what is this place? What is the history behind it? And what I am doing here? What is my role in this hierarchy of power and this system? And this actually is my focus of my work, of my books that I'm working on now, called 33 and in Heaven. Focus on the experience of immigrants through two experiences: the birth, for immigrants to have an American baby, and discover through this the question of race and identity and legal paper and health system, and the question of dying, which I'm writing now. What I'm doing now is most of the time I'm driving my car around the city to visit Las Vegas graveyards, which is also a very important question for immigrants. Immigrants, when they come and immigrants, they always have, after time, they start to have this question, what will happen to my body when I die? You would notice that a lot of immigrants will have these fantasies. If I died, I want my body to go back to my village. Not all immigrants have this privilege. But if you don't have this privilege, what should you do with your body in a new land like here? Yeah, I think place is center. It's, as you say, like it's center. I even like thinking of the place where my body will be buried after.
That's true. That's very true. Thank you for that. Sounds really fascinating. Looking forward to reading that when that comes out. And then finally, Rasha, you know, it's hard to believe, but you and I have known each other for over 10 years now. I mean, we met in Damascus.
Jordan,
Yeah,
but we met in Amman also.
We met in Amman.
Year after.
Yeah, exactly. We met in Damascus, then we reconnected in Amman. And, you know, in that time of knowing you, one of the things that I have really come to value is your sense of humor. And it's something that your work, especially the invention of German grammar, uses that humor to wonderful effect. And you said that you wrote the invention of grammar at one of your darkest periods in your life, when Syria was in, you know, a terrible phase of the uprising, and you were really unsure where you were going to be living permanently. And so I wanted to ask, why did you decide to write that book, that collection, with a humorous tone, especially since, you know, humorous literature is not really something that is universally celebrated in the Middle East?
That's right. And first of all, I will have to ask you all to try to take me seriously with this stupid gaming headset, but I was not able to find the more mature looking headset. And yeah, that's right, Matt. Like the invention of German grammar was my first like humorous book, and maybe it would be the last one. I'm not sure yet, because let me tell you something. Like, yes, besides the fact that it was written in one of the darkest moments, like in the Syrian uprising and in also my life, which are connected, of course. But also, like, really writing humor is difficult. And I feel it's one of the most difficult thing I ever tried, because, you know, and the failure in writing humor is also more difficult than the failure in any other genre, because, you know, when you are writing about like normal stuff and you fail, people like may not like it, may feel a bit sorry for you. But I feel when you try to make a joke or you try to be humorous and you fail, I feel that people really want you to drop dead or something, and you feel more ashamed. And so the idea of writing the book of the invention of German grammar in such of a dark moment, I think maybe comedy can relieve us a bit from being victimized, from telling our narration as a victim, which is something you don't want to do. And you feel like people are waiting for you to do it, waiting for this misery porn somehow. So I think writing comedy is a way to get through this without such a humiliation. But also to tell you something, beside like this, like writing a book reflecting some major causes and stuff like this, I also wanted to write a book that's just funny, that just would make people laugh or something. It's like a craft you would like to master. And that's right. And also, I think I did this with the help with my partner in this project, which is the translator, Sandra Hetzel. She translated the book also from Arabic to German. So I think it was useful to have a partner in such a project, dealing with such a sensitive topic. I think it was helpful for me to get like this eye of an outsider of the project. And that's right, I came from the background which this kind of literature, or actually any kind of literature which is not dealing like with big causes, like with political questions, and so is not really appreciated and is not even considered literature. So I think it's a way of liberation for me to try to explore like this kind of genres and topics like which were not that familiar in the place I came from.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I love that idea of comedy being able to relieve you from this idea of victimization, of victimhood. That's very powerful. And I just want to remind everyone that's watching, if you want to add a question, feel free to add a question to the Q&A box. You can drop a question there throughout the course of the conversation. But we're going to be broadening this out a little bit, and I'll be asking just general questions that I would like all of you to engage with. And the first one is, you're all such wonderful writers, but you come from very different backgrounds. And so I'm curious as to how your early experiences help to shape the writers that you've become. And maybe we can start with you, Ahmed, and then we can sort of broaden it out to there.
My early experience?
Yeah, early experiences. So maybe how did you come to love literature, storytelling, fiction? What sorts of moments did you have that sort of drove you into the direction of being a writer?
Well, for being a writer, this just happened lately, like when I was in the prison in 2016. Before that, I know for sure that I'm interested in writing. I'm interested in literature, but I didn't consider myself as a writer. I didn't want to give myself to writing and literature. I wanted to do other stuff. Although after I graduated from university, I started to work on Akhbar al-Adab, which is like a weekly literature magazine in Arab world. So all my life and all my career is being centered around literature and the art. But I always introduce myself as a journalist, documentary filmmaker, or other stuff that I will usually get myself busy around. And beside all of that, I was writing. I published my first book when I was like 23, and it was published accidentally. Like I didn't plan to have a book published. I just wrote this very, very long text that I thought it's a novel, and I bought it for free on my website back then. And then a publisher contacted me and wanted to publish it. And it continued like this even after publishing Using Life. Then the case happened, and I was sentenced for 2 years because of my writing. So I ended up in the prison, and in the prison you stayed all this time thinking and question your decision and choice. And you start to think, oh, is it worth it? Why I'm here? Like and even some intimate in the prison will come and ask me, if you know that what you are writing will lead you to the prison, are you going to write it? I know other writers always like to be vocal about their brave. Oh, I don't care. All right. I told them, of course, no, I will not write it, or I will not publish it. But then you start to question when you are in the prison, what is the next step, what you are going to do? And I start to wonder, oh, maybe I'm a writer. So what is the meaning of writing? What's behind it? Until this famous accident happened in the prison, which like I wrote about it, and which was like a transforming experience happening to me. In the prison, we have this guy who's like a very cold, he has like a very cold heart. He was accused of stealing like $400 million. He said they were just like 200 million. And because like he made this big hustle, so his father, which like was like an older guy, 79 years old, ended up in the prison with him. And he really, like, I never saw him showing any emotion. Like one day his father was having a heart attack and he was finishing his cigarette, not while everyone is rushing to rescue his father. But then one day I woke up in the middle of the night, it was like 2 a.m. and I went to the bathroom and I found him in the bathroom crying with tears, and his eyes is red. And I was shocked. Like I asked him, "Are you all right? What's happening? What's wrong with you? Is there something related to the case?" And he was like, "No, everything is fine. Just this book. Have you read this book? In my heart, there is an Hebrew Girl, which is a very romantic novel, a very Islamic romantic novel wrote by Dr. Khola Hamdi, a Tunisian writer. But it's very kitschy. It's one of this, like, romantic novels that is for detective for teenager or youth. And I was like, no, I didn't read it. And he was like, it's so pretty, it's so beautiful, it's affect me, it caused me like a pain in my chest. Like I left it in my bed and I came here because when even I looked to the cover of the book, I start to cry. And I was shocked. Of course, like in the next couple of days, he was following me, trying to force me to read the novel. And I tried, but like it's not my style and not what I'm interested to read. But I start to question what is this hidden power into literature, into telling a story, into writing novel that could reach to a guy like this guy and cause him chest pain in his chest. And this story, this experience was really shocking to me. It opened my eyes to other hidden power that we usually don't notice or hear. And part of that related to my beginning, because I started very early into the literature and culture scene in the Arab world. And I would say, like, I learned a lot, but also it killed a lot inside you. Because, like, when you become a professional writer or when you are working on the field surrounding by writer and culture, there is a sense of like, oh, we can't get affected. You are a writer. You can't praise other work or say, oh, I was reading this book when I cried. This is not a professional. You will not be a professional writer if you are doing this. And of course, there is the politicals between writers and each others and blah, 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 and so on. And it really sometimes affect how you read, how you see literature. But suddenly, when I was in the prison, also there was a unique experience for me because everyone is reading in the prison to pass the time, and those people are reader. They are what we call the normal reader. They don't know this writer. They don't know about this writer. I mean, I remember one of them came to me and was asking if I have any other books for this very funny, hilarious writer, and I looked, and he was talking about Dostoevsky. Okay. Because for him, and suddenly I was shocked. I was like, how come you see him as a funny or hilarious? And he was like, well, all of his novel, he must have like a clown or a stupid guy. It's all about like misunderstanding happening. And suddenly when you are reading this, you discover, yes, the guy is right. But as a professional writer, when we talk about Dostoevsky, no one will ever describe Dostoevsky as a funny writer or hilarious writer. So I believe like I had my experience when I was young as a journalist working on literature, news, and culture, and then I had this experience when I was in the prison with meeting with the normal reader, and both experience was a fundamental in pushing me towards making the decision to dedicate my time and my current life to writing.
That's really interesting, Ahmed. Thank you very much for that. And Rasha, what about you? What sort of early experiences did you have that sort of drove you to writing, to want to be a writer, or that have informed you as a writer?
Well, I remember I published my first book when I was 24 years old or something. But to be honest, even like till in this time, I never thought I would be a writer, actually, or like it would be the definition of what I do, a writer. Like, yes, in my late teenage years or early college year, I wrote some kind of poetry, but that was like the case for 90% of people in Syria in my generation. It was kind of really bad, cringy poetry. I'm really glad that every trace of this is gone now. And after that, I started working as a journalist. So I started working for a weekly magazine, which was covering some kind of crime news. And they would publish something like spy and suspense stories and stuff like this. And then I worked as a reporter for some local television channel. And I had really some long hours of not doing anything, but I had to be there. So I just found myself writing stories really for no purpose. I never thought I will publish them one day. And then there was a contest of stories announced. And I thought like, why the hell not? I just sent them. And for my surprise, they won. I never thought that they won, actually. And I remember even like at this point, one of the jury of this contest, like he called me and he said, look, like I'm one of the jury members, and what I'm doing now is not legal that I'm calling you, but I have to tell you, like your story collection, it will maybe not win because we are 3. I'll give you my vote, but I want to ask you, like, even if you did not win now, I would like to ask you to just keep writing because I liked it. And I don't know, of course, like, because he was a famous novelist in Syria. And so it was a great push for me, like forwards. And then after that, I just found myself writing. And I published like 2 books after that, and this is how it went.
That's interesting. That's a great story. I wish all judges of literary prizes were so generous. Yeah. Thank you, Rasha. And Zaina, what about you? What were some of your early experiences that sort of shaped you into being the writer that you've become?
Yeah, I mean, so I've been thinking about how to answer this. I think what brought me to writing in the first place was growing up in between the Middle East, between Jordan and Palestine and Washington, D.C. And constantly being, people would always say, oh, you're so lucky to have a foot in both worlds. But really, it felt like I had a foot in neither world, because if you're, you don't feel like you fully belong anywhere. So you're sort of on the outside. And when you're on the outside of something, you see it very differently than if you're fully immersed in it. And so I guess as a way to sort of like mitigate some of those feelings of like alienation and awkwardness, I started writing and like making sense of these observations and things that I was noticing about each culture that were really surprising to me. And I didn't study writing as an undergrad. I studied philosophy, I studied foreign affairs, and I was working on the business side of a magazine, very much like kind of wishing I was on the editorial side. But one day, in 2006, when the war broke out in Lebanon with Hezbollah and Israel, I was so affected by it that I wrote an essay, and I just sent it to like the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Christian Science Monitor, and the Christian Science Monitor published it. And they said like, oh, we think you have a really unique voice. And I didn't really understand at the time what that meant, a voice. And I think I now get it a little better. But so this sort of encouragement, like kind of like when you had that encouragement from the judge, I felt this encouragement that made me want to keep going. And it was also a time of by the way, it still is a time of huge amounts of misunderstanding and stereotyping and false premises when it comes to the Middle East in the States. And that was so frustrating to watch. And so I kept writing as a journalist, saying, writing stories and writing pieces that were related to Palestine and Israel. And I thought, as I was saying earlier, that like, I thought like I could write a million op-eds or a million essays. I wondered, like, how can you really somehow change the way people see, Arabs? And that kind of led me into writing fiction, thinking that like if you create characters that people can relate to, that also happen to be Arab or happen to be Muslim, then maybe that does something. And so I think what brought me to writing was, that the sort of in-betweenness and the outsiderness and the alienation, but also this desire to really challenge these stereotypes, to really change the way people see these, cut through these, false images and false representations. And also just to add to that, after I wrote that piece that got published, I moved to Boston to take an editorial internship at The Atlantic. And I didn't know anybody. And so I was coming home, I was writing for The Atlantic, which was very cool, but at night I had nothing to do. So I started a blog that I would share on Facebook. And that became such a helpful way to write, was to have this accountability and to sort of create this feeling like I had this online community. And from there, an editor who happened to be a friend of mine in Jordan asked me to write for their magazine. And so yeah, honestly, like that, yeah, I've always felt like I write alone, but because I can be so alone, I'm desperate to connect, and writing is that great vehicle for it. So
that's great. That's super interesting. Thank you for that. And I want to ask all of you. You've spoken to this a little bit already, each of you, but I'm curious about some of the challenges that you have faced writing from and about the different regions and cultures that you are part of and engage with. So what, I mean, obviously from being imprisoned to working with or writing about issues, in your case, Zaina, that, maybe are a bit challenging in terms of LGBTQ issues. Rasha, you were writing about, leaving Syria and writing, in a space where you were unsure where you would be safe physically. But what other kinds of challenges have you all faced as writers writing from the communities that you're writing from? And maybe Rasha, maybe we can start with you.
Well, yeah, it's an interesting question, but yet it's tricky to answer because really it's hard to answer this. Because it's you can trace this back to the original question of why we are writing, what is the purpose of writing. It's like between the personal and what is the responsibility of a writer. Should I be like documenting, delivering a message, whatever? And especially when you are talking about like some really cruel situation, like what's happening in Syria, for example. For me, I always see this, and like now, as Ahmed was describing this, of is it really a fresh start or is it a cut with your history? For me, with Syria, it feels really like this biblical story of the pillar of salt. Like if you turn back to this, like with this process of healing and recovery. And maybe it's a selfish thing, I think, maybe to talk about recovery, like when we are talking about writing, but maybe like you risk like turning into this pillar of salt when you are looking back to this ruin, to this burning city. But on the other hand, like the difference like between us and this biblical story, that we are not going to the kingdom of heaven. We are just moving forward, like being numb a bit inside, having only this image of the burning city alive. So I feel like maybe there is more of a chance of surviving by just turning back, writing, and looking directly to the ruin, instead of like, being just a walking corpse, but like feeling like you are really healed. So I feel it's like, coming from this background, I think it will always represent itself in what we are writing, even if we try to escape it. Like the question of oppression, of trying, like longing for justice and not finding it in the same time. I feel it will be always be there. Sometimes I wish I'm like in some other place, I don't know, and I can explore more joyful topics. But at the moment, I don't think that's something we can do really, even if we don't mean to.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rasha, for those thoughts. I really appreciate that. Zaina, what about you? What are some of the challenges that you find writing from the different communities that you write from?
So one of the big challenges is the sort of US publishing machine, in the sense that, like, for example, when I was like submitting my novel, a lot of the feedback I got was, oh, we want more women in hijabs, or more camels, seriously, people said that, or more spices in the marketplace, all this sort of like desire for more exotification and more sort of perpetuation of existing stereotypes, more violence, people said. Amazing. I mean, just goes to show. So this was very frustrating. And of course, the whole point of me writing was to challenge and subvert these narratives. And so I had to sort of say, no, I can't do that, right? While still very much wanting the book to be published and be published by like a big house and all of that, right? So the choice was to either staple a spice pack to the front cover or, but like, so that was, those sort of expectations are challenging to me. At the same time, I think I feel, since there aren't as many narratives coming from Arab writers that we see in the States and that we see, you know, there is also this sort of burden of representation, I think, as well, where it seems like you write a character and people assume that's all, that stands in for every Arab queer character, right, or something. And so I guess the way to challenge that is through a proliferation of narratives, right? So that there are many more stories, because, you know, you don't read one book with a white male guy and think, oh, all white male guys are like that, right? So that's another challenge. And then I think finally, one of the big challenges is like, you know, as I said, I very much want to subvert the narratives and the misunderstanding around the Middle East. And at the same time, I also don't, there's this thing where you don't want to, then you feel like, do you have to glorify your, you know, your culture, right? You don't want to do that either. You want to present a sort of multidimensional story that maybe the character does ugly things at times, right? And maybe the character, there are parts that are less than savory, but at the same time, I think that speaks to that burden of representation. It's feeling like everything you write becomes the ultimate representation versus just one story in a very large sort of landscape of many, many stories. And so yeah, those are things, it's a sort of difficult line to walk, especially writing like a queer Arab character is like sort of showing, you know, one narrative and stereotype I really hate is that, oh, you know, Arabs and Arab culture is really homophobic, you know, universally so. And that's not true. You know, I actually have more friends that are queer in the Middle East than I have in New York City. And at the same time, you can't say that, you know, there's a parade there happening every day either. So that's a hard line to walk, is to be true to the reality, but also to absolutely, you know, not perpetuate that stereotype that people have. And that sort of hypocrisy as well, because I mean, the US is homophobic, right? The US doesn't, when it comes to women's rights, we can see that there's a lot of huge problems here in the US as well. So I just think, obviously you can see I'm getting impassioned as I'm talking, because these are things that I think about a lot and challenges that you face as a writer, especially when you want the landscape of narratives to proliferate so that we can see all different stories from our part of the world that tell many different narratives.
Yeah, thank you, Zina. Absolutely, that's a wonderful answer. Thank you so much. And Ahmed, what about you? What have you found to be some of the challenges? We're having a hard time hearing you.
Hello?
There, that's better.
Okay. I think it's same to the challenges that most of writer in the United States is facing. It's how to find the key to the system, to the publishing system. I mean, to find an agent and then to find the publisher. And really here the system, the literature and publishing system in the United States, there is a lot of gatekeeper, and it takes you a lot of time to know the keys and how to write the keys. I have been, for example, writing letters and email to agent to try to get an agent, and then I discover one of my friends, the writer and American poet Fallita, was just giving me a crash course on how to write an email to an agent. So it's just like, so this is a big challenge for me, and I made a lot of mistake. For example, last year, like I sometimes signed a paper that was with some agent and publishers that I don't know what does it really mean. So this is really the big challenge that I'm facing. Other stuff, I have a curiosity about it, but it's not a challenge. I mean, for example, I came here and you found yourself under label like Arab American or Muslim American, and I don't understand really what this means, and I'm still trying, have curiosity about it, because, for example, where I came from, no one will dare to call me like an Arab writer in Egypt, because Arabic in Egypt mean Arab nationalism. It's an ideology. It's a separate ideology. Also, no one in Egypt will call me like a Muslim writer. But you come here and you go to a public event, and sometimes after the event, people will come to you and shake hands with you and tell you, "Oh, hello, brother. I am I'm a Muslim from Pakistan," and he feels there is a connection. I feel there is a connection because we are both immigrants. I feel this is an important connection, that we are an immigrants, and the legal system is putting us in the same label as an immigrants. But again, the meaning of Arab and Muslim here also is getting different. I think also Arab American is kind of very new things. Like I'm trying to understand, so I'm reading a lot about it, starting from Khalil Gibran to now. And you really start to notice how sometimes the politicals are playing role in shaping it, how the term itself being crafted by James Zorbi and his brother work starting from 70s until now. And I have a lot of question about it, and I have a lot of question about this labels, and it create also all these questions, that all these challenges that Zina was talking about, because you as a writer, you want to write about yourself, but suddenly, because you are under this label Arab American, you feel there is a weight that you're supposed to represent a group of people that you really don't know who's this people. You are just part of them, but this is a wide range of group. It's all over the world. It's all over the state. It's getting different depending on their ethnicity and their religions and so on. Like, for example, Egyptian Coptic here in the United States will not ever introduce themselves as an Arab American, because already Egyptian Coptic, they left Egypt escaping from Arab. So they don't come here and can be counting as an Arab. So imagine their position when they come here and found themselves under the label of Arab American, for example. So there is a lot of challenging about these labels, but for me, it's not a challenge. It moved my curiosity to read more and to do research and to talk to people and to learn about it, and maybe to write about it in the future.
That's really interesting, Ahmed. Thank you for that. And that leads me to another question I wanted to ask you three. And before I do, I want to remind everyone that they can post their questions to the Q&A if they want. We already have a couple great ones, so feel free to post some more. That leads me to this idea of Arab literature, because I think this is a DC Arab Literature Festival, and so I am curious. And Ahmed, you spoke about this just a moment ago, but what does that term Arab literature mean to you? And do you feel a connection with the Arab literary community? I'm sure that's a different answer for all of you, but maybe Zaina, we can start with you, and then we can go to Rasha and Ahmed. So Zaina, what does that term Arab literature mean to you? And do you feel a connection with that specific community?
I mean, yeah, of course, right? Like I constantly seek out writing by Arab writers, both writers that are living in the diaspora, writers that are living in the Middle East, right? Writers that come from all sorts of different backgrounds from the region, and then across genres as well. Like, I love to read Edward Said, I love to read Rashid Khalidi, I love to read the sort of political, but I also am really, I just am more and more, it's just so incredibly uplifting and exciting to see more and more like creative work coming out from Arab writers, many of whom I've sort of looked up to for years, including both the writers on this panel. So both the other writers besides myself. So like, indeed, yes, I think I derive comfort and strength from the existence of Arab literature and from its proliferation and from its increased visibility. At the same time, like, it's certainly not the only kind of literature I consume. I mean, especially having grown up in the States primarily, you're not, never once was I assigned a book to read by an Arab writer. And also I have no shame in saying that, many of my influences are, former colonialists, right? Like former, like French writers or British writers or American writers. And so I just think, sort of bouncing back and forth about this conversation about labels and identity and sort of like representation, I think there is, while I do love reading Arab literature and derive, as I said, comfort and strength from the fact that it exists. I also don't like the idea of having to categorize both what I write and what I consume, right? So like, I think it is what's so great and so powerful about literature and writing is it's a conversation that transcends national boundaries, that often can transcend language, that can transcend, all ethnic line. It's so interconversational that that while these different spheres of it exist and should exist, it's also they're also so transcendable and so sort of, they shouldn't be limiting. And so that's how I feel about it.
That's great. Yeah, it is. I mean, it's interesting to think about. I mean, obviously, I grew up in the United States as well, and was very infrequently, if at all, assigned literature from the Arab world in my literature classes. Ahmed, what about you? I mean, do you spoke just a moment ago about this idea of being an Arab American sort of foreign to you when you got to the United States. But what about being part of the Arab literary community? I mean, how do you think about that? And do you consider yourself part of that community?
Yeah, of course. And this is clear something to me. It's different than ideology or the Arabic nationalism. It's coming on the base of language. And the base of language that I started reading and writing in Arabic, and what shaped my knowledge of literature and art is coming from Arabic books that was written in Arabic language. And when we talk about Arabic language, we talk about an old heritage that's because, I mean, we are in 22, but I can open, and actually that what I was reading recently, I was reading Al-Gahaz, a writer who wrote his books 1,000 years ago. And I was reading it and I feel connected to it. I understand what he's talking. He's still talking about problem in writing and dealing with language that you still face it. So this was clear definition for me. I'm writing in Arabic, so I'm part of the Arabic culture and this Arabic definition. But it's becoming more complicated when you move here because you see people talking about Arab American, but there is no Arabic language representing. I mean, you open the website of the Arab American Museum and there is no Arabic there. It's all in English. And suddenly you start to question, so what is the meaning of Arab American here? And what is the meaning of Arab American culture here? And you start to question the definition of this question and you analyze that it's so different when we talk about, especially Arab American. Like, by the way, there is no such a term called Arab European, for example. There is no Arab France, okay? Because the France and European, they know the difference. They can't collect all Arab under one umbrella. They know the difference between a poor Arabic immigrants from Syria and a rich Arabic guy from Emirates and Dubai, okay? And they know that they are both so different and so different from the other guy in Morocco. But this term, Arab something, only exists in the United States, America. And as I'm saying, for me, it was like what I have a lot of question because there is no language base. We are not talking about people sharing the same language. And the language even is not representing in how American and how Arab American like perform their identity or what. So you see there is something political on it and it's not clear and it's always changing and sometimes it's controlling by some nationality of it. Like I read most of Arab American and I follow the activities and the stuff, but for example I wonder where is no Moroccan or North African country under this umbrella. Because Moroccan has a special identity since established the founding of United States. You know, Morocco is the first country to recognize United States. And United States Constitution and law gives the Moroccan citizen and the Moroccan state this label called Moro since an early age, since the 18th century. And separated the legal system of the United States, separating them from other Arab, for example. All of this is just like a question I'm curious about, and I'm curious to understand. I would say also for me, I remember, for example, I remember very well several years ago, I read Zaina wrote an amazing long article in The Believer about her father. And I remember very well when I was reading this article, I felt so much connected and understand her father than understanding her. Like she was like sometimes, and I read this article like 2 years ago really, but it's still in my memory. But I still have this sense of like, I know what this guy, she's her father, writing about is feeling. What is the meaning of his stay all this time, and why he want to go back to this town, and how this could affect him. And actually, when I was reading it, I was fantasizing myself of getting old and visiting Vegas again. But in the same time, I felt like disconnected from the eye of the daughter on how she's saying him. And there is also kind of separation inside when we are talking about Arab American writers and Arab American culture and artists. There is separation between Arab American who just immigrant, like the new immigrants, the fresh redneck, or the second or third generation. The gap between both generation is very big. How they see themselves and how they see their communities. So all of this, as I'm saying, is just like a question that I'm curious about. I don't have a clear answer. I'm just digging and reading and listening to other and discussion like this discussion with you.
Great, thank you, Ahmed. Yeah, that essay I believe is called "Our Era" that Zaina wrote, and you can probably find it on the Believer's website. Rasha, what about you? What when we talk about Arab literature, what comes to your mind, and do you feel part of that community now that you're living in Germany?
Well, first of all, the weird, or maybe not too weird thing, that I felt like an Arab when I was in Europe, when I moved to Europe after immigration from Syria, more than any, comparing to any time of my life. Like, for example, when I was in Syria, this question was not even important to me. And I would relate it to some narrow-minded, like nationalist idea. Like, what's the point of being Arab or not? Like, I did not really care for it. Now, somehow, like, after I'm in like this new home, being in Europe, I don't know how to explain this, but I feel more like an Arab. I'm more interested and like keen on being part of the Arabic literature scene, whatever that means. Like, I want to be part of it. I have a fear of being left behind the discussions, the topics that are urgent, and like in the Arabic world, like in literature. And yeah, like that's, and I feel also there is a new wave of Arabism, which is not similar to anything that happened before, like before decades. It's not this like populist Arabism that was able to gain power in countries like Syria and Egypt in the 70s or so. It's just like people, especially in art and literature, I feel like there are people like longing to communicate with each other, especially in the last 10 years, with more of common backgrounds of, you know, like wanting change and fighting oppressions and trying to make a change. And it's really like more of a cultural thing, and of communicating with someone with a similar experience rather than it being a nationalist kind of thing. That's regarding the Arabic literature and the Arabic scene. And so, but speaking about a community, I feel it's a bit different because, or maybe because writing is really an individual act, really. So I don't feel the urge of having a community of writer, a community of Arabic writer that you are always like in the middle of this. And also, let me tell you something. Sometimes I feel in the same level that we are like, we need to communicate with each other, especially people coming from extreme like backgrounds and difficult situations. And so sometimes there is a need to avoid each other as well. We need this to be healed, because sometimes you don't need this like daily trigger, and the part, maybe it's some part of your healing is really to be alone and to avoid these connections with your past like popping suddenly. So, but I told you that's maybe I feel like writing is really an individual kind of act, and I prefer the kind of relations with other Arabic writers like this, which is similar. You feel like you are someone living in the Victorian era, like writing long letters with different topics from your daily life to reference to like other discussions. So yeah, I think that's it for me.
That's really interesting, Rasha. Thank you for that. And I want to thank all of you for having written questions. We're going to get to those in a moment. It's interesting. I'm looking at the questions now, how many of them have actually been sort of answered in the course of the discussion, which is great. But there's one question that someone wrote to me offline that I want to ask. And, you know, since all of you have sort of, you know, Zaina, you were born in the you were born in the U.S. Yeah, Zaina, or were you? I
was born in Los Angeles. So yeah,
born in Los Angeles. Yeah. So, but you know, I'm curious if you can imagine yourselves not having left the places of your birth, or Zaina, in your case, your family's birth. So, Ahmed, if you had not left Egypt, Rasha, if you had not left Syria, Zaina, if your family was still in Palestine. You know, how do you think that would have impacted yourselves as writers, and sort of the stories that you tell and how you tell them?
Do I start?
Sure.
I really
sorry,
don't know.
Sorry, yeah, go ahead. Yeah. You don't know?
I really don't know, like, because this is like a different scenario. If I stayed in Egypt, I don't know. Maybe I will be in the prison now, because this is where all my friends are in now. Or I will quit writing, for example, because this is the other options now. Things in Egypt is becoming really brutal and harsh, and people are silent, depressed, or in the prison, or in exile. So the existing there even is like, what? I don't have an answer. For sure, I will be afraid. I will be writing under the fear, and for sure this could lead my writing experience into a total different direction. Maybe I will end up like one of the CC guys of the regime writer, for example. Or maybe I will end up one of the writer for Gulf states, for example, praising like Gulf Sheikh and so on. I really don't know. This is like an very tricky question to try to imagine. I actually, before leaving the Egypt, before my case, I was planning to get a license to work as an agent for belly dancers. So this was my career path before entering the prison and leaving the country. So maybe because, like I was saying, the country is heading into a total brutal military state, and it will be impossible for me to continue as a journalist, as a writer. So I was trying to move business to organize events and belly dancing show and stuff like that. So this maybe will be my path then.
Oh, that's very interesting. Rasha, what about you? What if you had not left Syria? I mean, it's a complicated question, because Syria is very different now than what it was when I first met you all those years ago. But what would you envision yourself? How would you envision yourself as a writer if you were still in Syria?
Well, I share Ahmed. Like I would fear, like for my personal security. I don't know, like personally, if I would end up in some prison or like in Syria. You can imagine anything. But like regarding writing, and I know that I will get a lot of hate saying that, because it's a stupid cliche, but I believe it. I think my writing would be better, because yes, I believe like in this saying that with pressure it comes a better writing. And now when I look back to what I used to write when I was still in Syria, even in the time of the uprising, in this difficult time, in the early years of the uprising, I feel there is something I miss now. I feel like since I moved to Europe, like to the life of safety and freedom, I kind of signed an unwritten contract that I like. With that, I give up like I don't know, something original of myself and what I write, and it's not there anymore. And maybe I don't care, you know, like because maybe I prefer to like live like in safety and being safe than being really talented, because that's something you might want to accept. But yeah, I feel like it would be, I don't know, I feel I would write better. That's how I imagine it if I still in Syria, but maybe I would be in a great danger.
Interesting.
Or maybe not like Ahmed, like maybe I would be come back to and be crazy and be like a regime supporter or something, because you never know what a human is capable of doing. But I really hope not.
That's so fascinating. Thank you, Rasha. And Zaina, what about you? What if you?
I mean, I think I'm just still ruminating over these answers from before. And I think that word you're looking for, the urgency, like dissipates a little bit when you leave the high conflict, high stress scenario, right? And writing is driven by urgency often. So, but I think about this question a lot because I'm obsessed with counterfactuals and what would have been. And I often fantasize that my parents had never left and hadn't like had to leave Palestine, right? And had stayed, and I had been grown up there, because every time I'm there, I love being there, even though it's under occupation, even though it's a difficult life, but there's such beautiful things about it as well. Number one being the sort of community that in a city like New York, you definitely lack, no matter how many friends you have. But I think that it's hard to say, because so much of my writing has been driven by the fact of being culturally in between, of growing up between both these worlds, of being first generation and having immigrant parents, and of watching the misrepresentations of Arabs in the US media. So it's hard. I honestly think I still would have been a writer. I think I would have taken on entirely different subject matters, where I think, so similar to what both I think Ahmed and Rasha have said, that like being in the Middle East, you don't identify as Arab when you're there, right? So I think my stories would have been even less sort of Palestinian or even less Arab, right, than they are here. Because it's when you leave and when you're in a minority, you're sort of defined by your otherness in some sense, and that can color your writing. So I think if I'd grown up there, I'd probably be telling stories set on Mars or something that had nothing to do with Arabs. So yeah, that's what I think.
That's really interesting. Thank you very much. And I want to ask one other small question that came in. First of all, in the chat box, if you haven't seen, a lot of people are giving some wonderful comments to all of you. So again, thank you so much for posting those, and to the three of you for participating. And I just, one question that came up was and Ahmed, you had talked a little bit about it earlier, was about the role that Arabic language plays in Arab literature. And so for Rasha and Ahmed, do you both still write in Arabic, or have you branched out into German and or English? And Zaina, have you attempted at all to write in Arabic? So maybe we can start with Rasha, and then we can quickly go through that answer. Rasha, do you write in German, or you still write mostly in Arabic?
No, I'm still surviving to learn German just to use it in my daily life. It's so hard yet to read, but it's my fault, of course, but also because I'm living in Berlin and everybody's speaking English. So it was a bit hard for me to really master German, but I don't feel even in any time soon that I would like to write in other language than Arabic. And this is not like because like something national or something or because I'm proud of Arabic language, but because like simply I don't see the point of this. Like till now, I feel like Arabic is the language which I'm more familiar with, I'm more in control also. Like it's a home, it's like a home to me. So till now, like unless it's something experimental or something, I don't really see the point of writing directly in another language.
That's really interesting. Thank you for that. And Ahmed, I'll turn to you next. I know you and I have actually talked a lot about this before and in previous conversations that we've had. What about you? Because I know that you actually, if I'm right, you do have a desire to write in English at some point.
So I think for sure, maybe in a couple of years, I'm heading this way. I'm still trying and experiments. I wrote a small text and I shared it with close friends, but that I'm not really proud of it. I also noticed lately, because lately also I'll be getting requests to write or publish something from American or English publication. So suddenly and they will offer, oh, you write in Arabic and then we will translate. So suddenly I found myself in the situation that I'm writing in Arabic, but I know that what I'm writing for a translator who will translate it, not for the Arabic audience. And lately I found when I'm doing so, I'm writing in both Arabic and English in the same text, because I'm just writing for my translator, which is a very unique situation that I am in now. Because sometimes, especially, let's say I'm writing about stories that happening in Las Vegas. So I'm writing it in Arabic, but the dialogue, rather than writing in Arabic and translating into English, I write it directly in English. And then when the translator come and he translates the stuff, I'm reading it in English. And now, after 4 years here, I start to have a new sense to the language. Like, I will interfere with translator and I tell him, no, I don't want this word here. I want this other word. Because I start to have my sense on language. So I'm in this process now between two language, but my ambition, my big dream is to continue writing in both language, in Arabic and English.
That's
I want to write in English to be able to interact with people here, with my new place and my new community. I want to be able to express myself and to engage in the discussion. And in the same time, I want to have my connection to the Arabic literature, which is like I'm more familiar with, and which is like I'm in love more with the language, with the Arabic language there. And I have an ambition to discover and experiment in this language, the Arabic language. But also I'm eager to be able to express myself freely and to craft a style and a voice in English language.
that's really fascinating, because there's obviously a very rich tradition in the United States of authors from across the world landing here in exile and writing eventually in English. We could all name many of them. Zaina,
Yes.
what about you? Are you do you write it all in Arabic? Do you have any intention to write in Arabic?
I love writing in Arabic in the sense that I like just writing things. Like I've never written creatively in Arabic, although I eventually hope I will and would love to. You know, it's funny because it didn't, when I was writing this first book, of course, it certainly didn't occur to me to write it in Arabic. But yani, inshallah, in a future book, I will. Just have to dust up my fusha. No, I just have to dust up my language, my writing and reading a bit. But I find that I think a lot in Arabic, so maybe it will help me when it comes to writing creatively in Arabic as well. Yeah.
That's great. That's great. Well, we are unfortunately out of time. I feel like we could talk for a very long time together, but I want to thank all of you for joining us, all our audience. We had a wonderful audience today, so thank you so much for joining, and to Rasha, to Zaina, and Ahmed for being part of this panel, being part of this festival. We, after this panel ends, there'll be another panel on modern poetry that starts at 12:30. So you can log on to Swego and join that panel if you would like. And there are, of course, panels tomorrow as well that are going to be focusing a bit more on the structural side of Arab literature in terms of promoting it and whatnot. So I think we're very excited for this festival. Come see us at 12:30 again for another panel. And again, to Zaina and to Ahmed and to Rasha, this was amazing. Thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to staying in touch.
Thank you so much, Matt, for such great questions.
Thank you, Matt.
And Rasha and Ahmed, so lovely to be in conversation with you. And yeah, and thanks for the kind words, Ahmed, about the believer piece as well. It meant a lot.
Yeah, and I got the new book. It's in my schedule, but I didn't start reading it.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, thanks. I would love to stay in touch with both of you. So it's great to connect.
I would love to.
Yeah.
Thank you all. It was delightful.